200 of America's most elite warriors were secured in their seats aboard that military transport. Navy SEALs, commanding officers, veterans who believed they had witnessed everything imaginable. Among them sat a single Army lieutenant, whom no one welcomed. The ridicule began even before takeoff. She was labeled a bureaucratic officer, a desk-bound pilot, an unwanted passenger who had no business being there. However, when thick smoke invaded the passenger compartment and the plane started its deadly descent, where mockery instantly ceased. When the SEAL pilot emerged from the flight deck in desperation, he wasn't searching for the person with the most commanding presence or impressive credentials. His eyes sought her out specifically. Before I reveal how this unlikely officer became the sole reason 200 fighters returned home safely, please subscribe and leave a comment sharing your location around the globe. Now let's dive into this story. The overcast dawn settled over Norfolk Naval Air Station like stale smoke from cigarette stents and slow to dissipate. Moisture continued falling from aircraft hangar rooftops as the final passengers approached the waiting C-40 Clipper. This wasn't an ordinary passenger aircraft. The dull gray body displayed only Navy markings and tail numbers that immediately identified its origin to military personnel. Nearly every seat inside was occupied by SEAL operatives, experienced non-commissioned officers, and commanders traveling between assignments. Individuals who moved with the relaxed assurance of those who had spent too much time living dangerously. Lieutenant Kara Hensley hesitated at the base of the boarding stairs, repositioning the bag on her shoulder. At 32, she served in the Army Aviation Corps, her black hair secured in a regulation bun. She dressed in standard fatigues, nothing distinctive except for the obvious fact that she was out of place. Not here, not aboard a transport filled with SEALs packed together tightly. The men boarding ahead exchanged familiar jokes, speaking quietly, but with that distinctive self-assurance that came from surviving experiences most people only witnessed in films. Just another routine flight, commented one, bending to enter the doorway. His companion responded with a snort. I hope they brought enough alcohol for the post-mission briefing. Their amusement resonated down the stairway. It's casual and contemptuous. When Kara entered the cabin, discussions didn't halt, they transformed. Heads pivoted with the swift, practiced evaluation that only operators performed. Assessing her uniform, rank insignia, and body language, Army, not Navy, and certainly not Special Forces. What's an Army officer doing on this flight? Someone whispered loud enough to be overheard. Another voice responded, probably logistics, pencil pusher catching a ride. The comments weren't yet malicious. Just the natural way close-knit units identified outsiders, the instinctive wariness of groups who had earned their position through sacrifice and hardship. Viewing someone who hadn't paid an equivalent price, Kara remained silent, keeping her focus on her boarding document as she located her assigned seat in the middle of the cabin. While stowing her bag beneath the seat, she felt the pressure of curious stares. No one shifted to create additional space. That was acceptable. She had grown accustomed to this treatment over 12 years of being the sole woman in hangars thick with grease and masculinity. The quiet presence among louder reputations. The engines hadn't started yet, but tension filled the air like humidity before a thunderstorm. This was meant to be a flight among brothers, where everyone belonged to the same fraternity except her. Kara settled into her seat, fastened her seatbelt, and retrieved the small notebook she always carried, not a personal journal, but work notes containing aircraft tail numbers, engine characteristics, and maintenance records. It occupied her hands, while conversation flowed around her, 2 rows forward. A petty officer turned sideways with a smile that didn't reflect in his eyes. I suppose the Army is outsourcing their mechanics these days. His companion chuckled, ice clinking in his pre-flight beverage. You're on the wrong aircraft, Lieutenant. This one's for warriors, not paper pushers. The laughter that erupted was more cutting now, designed with sharp edges meant to wound. Kara maintained a neutral expression, her pen continuing to move across the page as if she hadn't heard anything. But when the flight attendant completed her passenger count and secured the hatch, Kara's gaze briefly lifted toward the bulkhead. The aircraft's identification plate gleamed in matte steel. Displaying numbers, she recognized tail codes she had encountered before. She knew this particular aircraft, understood its history and peculiarities, the way it communicated when systems began failing. The realization flickered across her features and vanished before anyone noticed outside. Engines coughed to life with that familiar whine building to a roar. The cabin lighting dimmed as they began taxiing toward the runway. Laughter resumed around her, easy, confident, dismissive. Kara folded her hands over the notebook and observed rain streaking the small porthole as the aircraft pointed its nose toward the Atlantic darkness. Once they reached cruising altitude over dark waters, the cabin settled into comfortable patterns card. Games, quiet discussions, men stretching out for the long journey ahead. It didn't take long for attention to return to Kara. Two senior officers sitting across from her exchanged significant glances. It looked like someone called in favors. One said loudly enough to be heard, "Army bureaucrat on a SEAL charter?" "His colleague laughed. "Every flight needs someone to count the coffee supplies, correct?" Amusement rippled through nearby rows, sharp enough to cut. A younger petty officer leaned forward with exaggerated curiosity. "So, what exactly is your job, Lieutenant?" "Maintaining the copy machines? Ensuring helicopters receive their scheduled maintenance?" Kara's eyes glanced up momentarily. "I keep aircraft operational," she replied, her voice steady as calm water, then returned to her documentation. "That's the issue with the Army," the first officer continued. "Do many desk pilots extensive training but no actual combat experience. You'd never survive in our branch of service." Murmurs of agreement settled over nearby rows like atmospheric pressure. Even men who hadn't participated seemed to lean away, slightly association in its most refined form, not shouted insults, but the quiet withdrawal of acceptance. Kara sat completely motionless, her spine erect against the seat back. She had experienced this before, in maintenance facilities where technicians assumed she couldn't disassemble a turbine. On testing grounds where senior officers questioned her ability to handle G-forces, years of proving herself in environments not designed for people like her had taught the same lesson repeatedly. Sometimes the only path forward was silence. Allow them to underestimate you until reality revealed itself. Her pen ceased moving. She closed the notebook and slipped it into her pocket. Then her gaze wandered again toward the bulkhead, to that stenciled tail number above the emergency. Equipment. Recognition sparked behind her eyes, subtle and nearly invisible. She understood this aircraft's background, the repairs documented in oil-stained logbooks, the quirks that kept it airborne when logic suggested it should fail. But she kept this knowledge private, settling back with her hands folded around her. Laughter resumed its casual rhythm while she waited, patient as steel beneath paint. The second hour brought tranquility, meal service, card games, men settling into long-haul routines. Kara remained focused on her notebook, making technical annotations that appeared like paperwork to casual observers. Her isolation hadn't escaped notice. Two SEALs raised their cups in mock tribute. "Here's to the Army representative riding along," one declared with a broad grin. "May the paperwork never end." More laughter followed. The first leaned closer, his voice carrying, "Seriously though, what's your background?" "Test pilot who accumulates flight hours without anyone returning fire. Must be pleasant flying under controlled circumstances while the rest of us handle the dangerous work." Kara closed her notebook with deliberate precision. "For years as an Army test pilot, maintenance officer before that, I've repaired Apaches. In sandstorms and piloted Blackhawks with half their avionics destroyed." The SEAL raised his eyebrows, unimpressed. "Sounds like support work to me." His partner added, "Everyone has their role. Some breach doors, others maintain the oil levels." The group erupted again, laughter spreading farther this time. Kara allowed the moment to pass. Wellveers had taught her that truth emerged when metal was tested beyond its capabilities. She leaned back against the headrest, eyes half closing while her hand rested on the closed notebook. Through the oval window, the Atlantic stretched infinite and black beneath cloud cover. Inside, the laughter faded back to card games and partial conversations, but her mind remained alert, attentive to details others overlooked. The engine sound wasn't quite correct, nothing dramatic enough to concern anyone else. but present, a subtle irregularity that prevented her from drifting into the half-sleep of extended flights. She had learned long ago that aircraft communicate with people who know how to listen. Currently, this one was beginning to whisper. Hours over ocean felt interminable, engines providing constant white noise. Most passengers tuned it out after 30 minutes, but Kara never learned to ignore it completely.
Years in maintenance facilities had reprogrammed her hearing. Engines weren't just sound, they were dialogue. Somewhere over deep Atlantic waters, that dialogue started transforming. It began as a vibration through the seat frame, almost undetectable. Kara's fingertips pressed against her armrest, reading the rhythm. This wasn't weather-related, it was mechanical, with pattern and intention. She sat forward, eyes focusing toward the port wing. Everything appeared normal, but underneath the drone, she detected something else, a subtle decrease in tone, an engine no longer harmonizing perfectly. Then the lights flickered once, but long enough for conversations to pause. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing minor technical difficulties. Please remain seated. Nothing to be concerned about." But Kara caught the scent, faint, almost buried beneath recycled air. Burning insulation. Around her, men were relaxing, shoulders easing. She had heard those same reassurances before, in hangars where engines had seized 60 seconds later. She closed her eyes briefly, centering herself the way combat had taught her. The aircraft pressed into her consciousness, more insistent now, mechanical voices attempting to tell a story only she seemed interested in hearing. When she opened her eyes again, her hand had found the notebook without conscious thought. But she didn't write anything, just held it, waiting for the next verse in a song that was growing more urgent with every mile over dark water. The first bang cut through headphone music and card game chatter like a knife. It originated from the port side, a sharp metallic crack followed by a shudder that rippled through the entire fuselage. Overhead, storage bins rattled, beverages spilled, and men who had been dozing snapped to attention with the instant awareness that separated operators from civilians. A heartbeat later, the engine note changed, no longer steady but coughing, sputtering, trying to find its rhythm like a runner with a cramp. Every conversation died simultaneously. Then came the smoke, thin gray wisps seeping from overhead vents, carrying that unmistakable smell of electronics overheating under stress. It drifted forward through the cabin, curling lazily in the artificial lighting. For perhaps 3 seconds, nobody spoke. Then a voice shattered the silence. "That isn't turbulence." The seatbelt indicator flashed on with a chime that sounded absurdly gentle for what was happening. The intercom buzzed, but this time the smooth female voice wavered. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated while we," static consumed the rest. Fear bloomed instantly. Seasoned warriors or not, some things triggered primitive responses that training couldn't suppress. Men gripped armrests with white knuckles, voices rising in overlapping demands. Someone half stood before being pushed back down by a flight attendant whose smile looked desperate. "Stay seated, everyone. Stay calm." The aircraft shuddered again, harder this time. A laptop bag tumbled from an overhead compartment before the bin slammed shut. Someone cursed in 3 languages. From the cabin's rear, a young voice muttered, "We're losing power." And the words spread like wildfire through dry grass. Kara sat frozen in appearance only. Her eyes moved systematically across the cabin, cataloging details others missed. The uneven vibration in the floor plating, smoke thickening near the forward bulkhead, emergency lighting beginning to flicker in patterns that weren't supposed to exist. She had witnessed this progression before, different aircraft, different skies, but the same lethal sequence. System failure breeding panic faster than flames ever could. The senior officers were shouting now, all pretense of calm authority stripped away. One barked at the flight attendants over engine noise, "Get answers. What's happening up there?" His companion jabbed toward the sealed cockpit door. "Get the captain out here. We're not sitting blind." But their bluster deceived nobody, least of all themselves. Fear had a way of reducing everyone to the same basic elements: raised voices, flushed faces, the animal terror of falling from 6 miles up. The shuddering intensified. Oxygen masks began dropping from their housings, dangling like strange fruit. Someone shouted a prayer in Spanish. Another man gripped the seat in front of him so hard his knuckles went bone white. Kara's heartbeat slowed instead of accelerating, The way combat training had rewired her responses. When everyone else panicked, you became quieter, more focused. She breathed steadily through her nose, cataloging symptoms, waiting for whatever came next. That's when the cockpit door swung open with authority that cut through chaos like a blade. The man who stepped out wore a flight suit marked with a kind of wear that came from actual use, not ceremonial appearances. Close-cropped hair showing gray at the temples, weathered face carrying the particular gravity of someone who had faced worse skies than these. His movements were economical, precise, cutting through the aisle without acknowledging the hands reaching for his sleeves or the voices demanding explanations. Commander Nathan Cole. His reputation had preceded him through whispered stories in ready rooms and maintenance bays. SEAL Aviator, the kind of pilot other pilots discussed in hushed tones. He ignored the chorus of demands from senior officers, brushed past their grasping hands like they were children. When he spoke, his voice carried not through volume but through the absolute certainty of command. Lieutenant Hensley. The words detonated louder than any mechanical failure. Every conversation stopped. Every head swiveled as though pulled by invisible strings. Dozens of eyes found Kara's face, expressions shifting from confusion to dawning realization. Cole's gaze locked on hers with the precision of a targeting system. "I need you in the cockpit right now." The silence that followed was so complete it made the engine noise seem overwhelming. The same men who had spent hours dismissing her competence sat with mouths slightly open, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Around them, other passengers stared openly, recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the quiet army officer in the middle seats. Kara unbuckled without hesitation, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. Her notebook slipped into her pocket. The aisle opened before her like water parting, men unconsciously pulling back as she stood. For the first time since boarding, nobody was laughing. She followed Cole toward the cockpit, aware of every eye tracking her movement, every whispered question hanging in smoky air. Behind her, the same officers who had questioned her belonging now sat stunned into silence, their earlier mockery echoing in their own ears like accusations. The reinforced door swung shut behind them, sealing her into the crisis that would either prove or destroy everything she had spent 12 years learning. And for the first time that flight, the aircraft had everyone's complete attention. The cockpit was chaos, warning chimes competing, red lights flashing across panels, air thick with heat and burning circuits. Mason hunched over his console, hands flying across switches. Hydraulics bleeding out. "It's not bleeding where you think," Kara said, voice cutting through electronic noise. Mason spun around. "Who the hell?" "She's Army Aviation," Cole interrupted. "More turbine experience than both of us. She stays." The aircraft lurched hard left before Cole hauled it back. Kara strapped into the observer seat, eyes scanning displays with practiced rhythm. "Port engine temperature readings are false," she said after 15 seconds. "Exhaust pattern doesn't match. That sensor is cooked. Throttle back based on those numbers, and you'll lose the engine completely." Cole adjusted power instantly. The violent shuddering eased. Mason blinked between her and the gauges, skepticism giving way to amazement. "Crossfeed valve stuck," Kara continued, studying hydraulic readouts. "It's bleeding pressure into the wrong circuit. Manual override to auxiliary should stabilize rudder control." Cole didn't hesitate. "Do it." Mason's fingers flew. Pressure levels steadied, wild lurching smoothed. For the first time in 20 minutes, the aircraft felt manageable. "You've patched this before?" Cole asked. "Afghanistan. Chinook took a power surge mid-mission. We nursed her home on instinct and jury-rigged parts." Another alarm screamed. "Fuel imbalance." Mason cursed. "It's sensor bleed," Kara said immediately. "Systems feeding false data again." Cole reset manually. Warning lights died. The cockpit fell into relative quiet. "You're not leaving this seat until we're on the ground," Cole said. "Understood, sir." Behind the sealed door, 200 men sat in tense silence. Word was already spreading through the cabin. Whispered conversations about the army officer in the cockpit, the one the SEAL Aviator had called by name. The woman who might be the only reason they were still flying. The same men who dismissed her hours earlier now hung on every change in engine tone, each one silently hoping the person they had underestimated was exactly who Commander Cole believed her to be. In the cockpit, Kara had forgotten about notebooks and dignity and all the reasons she didn't belong. This wasn't about proving herself anymore. This was steel and aluminum and physics demanding answers in real time from someone who understood their language. And for the first time since takeoff, the aircraft was responding like something that wanted to keep flying. The storm swallowed them completely. Black clouds pressed against every window, rain hammering the fuselage with enough force to sound like machine gun fire. Lightning split the darkness so close that for heartbeats the cockpit blazed white before plunging back into shadow. The aircraft bucked and twisted through the turbulence like a bronco trying to throw its rider, every gust threatening to tear control surfaces from their mounts. Cole kept his grip light but firm on the yoke, fighting the natural instinct to muscle the aircraft through each violent shake. Mason muttered prayers under his breath, switching between backup systems as primary ones flickered in and out of life. The altimeter needle jumped wildly. In conditions like these, with half their instruments lying and the other half dying, flying became less science than art. "Talk to me," Cole barked over the chaos of alarms and weather. Kara's eyes swept from gauges to the small side window, reading the aircraft's body language instead of relying on electronic translations. Port engines still running rough but not failing. Don't reduce power. Hydraulics are bleeding again, pressure dropping faster. How long? Minutes, maybe 5 if we're lucky. The aircraft dropped into an air pocket, falling what felt like 1,000 feet before Cole could arrest the descent. Screams echoed faintly from the cabin through the reinforced door. An oxygen mask broke loose from its housing above Mason's seat, swinging wildly in the turbulence. "Stop fighting it." Kara's voice cut sharp through the noise. "You're trying to muscle through every gust. Let her flex. She's designed to bend, not break. Fight the weather and you'll tear the wings off." Mason looked back wild-eyed, sweat streaming. Cole caught Kara's gaze and nodded once. "You heard her. Ease off." They adjusted their technique, working with the storm instead of against it. The aircraft still bucked violently, but the airframe stopped groaning in protest. Wings flexed as they were meant to, absorbing punishment instead of transmitting it straight to the fuselage. Kara pointed at the hydraulic display where numbers were painting an increasingly desperate picture. "Feed auxiliary power to the backup system. Just enough to take pressure off that crossfeed valve. It won't survive another full cycle." Cole's hands moved without hesitation, following her guidance with a kind of trust usually reserved for pilots who had flown together for years. The gauges steadied fractionally, still critical, but no longer counting down to complete failure. Lightning flashed again, and in its brief illumination, Kara saw the vapor trail streaming from the starboard engine housing. Her chest tightened. "Fuel imbalance is getting worse. We're bleeding into the wrong tank." Mason's voice cracked slightly. "System shows all valves closed." "System's wrong," Kara interrupted. "Manual override. If we don't balance the load, we'll spiral." Cole gave Mason a sharp nod. Switches flipped. And after agonizing seconds, the fuel balance needle crept back toward center. The threat of an uncontrollable spin receded, leaving only the storm and failing systems to contend with. In the relative lull that followed, Cole's voice was granite. "Nearest divert." "Keflavik," Mason answered, hands still shaking slightly. "Hour and a half if we can hold together." Cole's jaw set in determination. "We'll hold." He turned briefly to look at Kara. "Can she make it?" Kara studied the instrument panel, then watched the wing flex through another violent gust, reading stress patterns like a language she had spent years learning to speak. "Keep the auxiliary system alive. Don't let that valve lock completely. And yes, she'll make it." For 90 minutes, they fought the storm together. 3 people, 1 dying machine, and weather that seemed determined to finish what mechanical failure had started. Every correction Kara called, Cole implemented without question. Every adjustment Mason made followed her guidance. The margin between survival and disaster shrank with each mile, but the aircraft held together through willpower as much as engineering. Behind them, the cabin had fallen into supernatural quiet. SEALs who had laughed at her competence now sat rigid in their seats, listening to engine tones with the intensity of people whose lives depended on mechanical music they would never learn to understand. By the time Icelandic coastline flickered through the storm, black cliffs, white foam, runway lights cutting through sheets of rain, everyone on board knew the truth. The army officer they dismissed was the only reason any of them were still alive. The Icelandic coast materialized through walls of rain like a mirage made of stone and foam. Black volcanic cliffs rose from churning water, runway lights at Keflavik cutting through the storm in precise geometric lines. The cockpit had become a pressure cooker of tension, every system pushed beyond its limits, held together by improvisation and prayers. "Gear down," Cole ordered. Mason's hand moved to the switch. The response was immediate and wrong. A deep groan shuddered through the airframe, reluctant and mechanical. Warning lights erupted across the panel like 4th of July fireworks, each one screaming disagreement with a simple request to lower the landing gear. "Hydraulics won't hold," Mason said, voice tight. "Systems fighting itself." "Gravity extension," Kara said immediately. "Override hydraulic assist and let physics do the work." Cole nodded once. Mason yanked the manual lever. For terrifying seconds, there was nothing but storm noise and electronic protests. Then clunk one wheel. Clunk, another. 3 green lights flickered to life, weak but present. "Gear down and locked," Mason breathed, disbelief coloring his voice. The runway rushed toward them through curtains of rain, approach lights strobing past like tracer rounds. Crosswinds clawed at the aircraft, trying to push them off course. Cole fought to keep the nose aligned, while Kara called corrections like a second set of instruments. 2 degrees right. Don't overcorrect for the gust. Let her settle. Ease throttle now. Port engine surging. Hold it steady. Copy, Cole growled through gritted teeth. In the cabin behind them, 200 warriors sat in absolute silence. Some prayed quietly. Others simply stared ahead, strapped tight against whatever was coming. No one spoke. The time for words had passed hours ago. The tarmac leaped up to meet them. Impact, landing gear slammed concrete with the violence of a controlled crash. The entire aircraft bounced once, hard enough to lift stomachs into throats, before wheels bit down and held. Brakes shrieked in protest, smoke pouring from tires as Cole fought to keep them straight down the runway centerline. Rain slicked the surface, crosswinds kept pushing, and for long seconds it was impossible to tell if the aircraft would hold together or slide sideways into disaster. Gradually, inevitably, momentum bled away. The shriek of brakes softened to a whisper. The shuddering eased. And finally, the C-40 Clipper rolled to a complete stop on rain-soaked concrete. 4 long heartbeats. Nobody breathed. Then the cabin exploded. Applause, shouts, laughter that bordered on hysteria, sobbing muffled by hands pressed to faces. 200 hardened warriors releasing tension in the only way humans knew how, with noise and motion and overwhelming relief. They were alive. All of them. Against every reasonable expectation, they had made it. Cole shut down the engines one by one, his movements deliberate and final. In the sudden relative quiet, only rain drumming the windscreen now, he turned to look at Kara with eyes that held weight no regulation manual could measure. "Lieutenant," he said, voice steady but heavy with meaning, "that landing goes in your logbook too." She met his gaze and nodded once. There was nothing else that needed saying. Emergency crews were already swarming the aircraft, their lights painting the rain-soaked tarmac in reds and blues. The cabin door opened with a hiss, cold Icelandic air rushing in to mix with the lingering smell of smoke and fear and survival. Cole stepped out with Kara beside him into the storm. Ground crew froze mid-motion as they watched him come to attention on the slick tarmac and render a crisp salute, not to his co-pilot, not to the senior officers who had spent the flight questioning her worth, but to the Army lieutenant who talked them through impossible conditions. Kara returned the salute with equal precision, rain streaming down her face. The gesture cut through noise and confusion like a signal flare, witnessed by every man filing down the aircraft stairs. It wasn't ceremony, it was recognition between professionals, acknowledgement of competence demonstrated when everything else failed. At the bottom of the steps, the senior officers who had mocked her earlier stood apart from other passengers, soaked and silent. They couldn't meet her eyes when she walked past. One managed a stiff, awkward nod that might have been an attempt at apology, but shame made it impossible for him to speak. The other studied his boots like they held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. Kara didn't linger on their discomfort. Dignity restored didn't require their validation. She shouldered her duffel and walked toward terminal lights glowing warm through the storm, her stride steady despite exhaustion. Behind her, the C-40 sat battered but intact, emergency crews examining systems that had been pushed beyond their limits and somehow survived. Tomorrow, investigators would document every failure, write reports that became case studies in aviation programs. But none of that analysis would capture what really happened during those crucial hours, the moment when theoretical knowledge met practical experience, when years of working with dying machines translated into keeping 200 people breathing. The terminal doors opened with a rush of heated air, the scent of coffee and disinfectant surprisingly welcome after hours of breathing smoke and fear. Kara paused only once, looking back through glass at the storm-battered runway where their aircraft crouched like a wounded bird that had made it home. She had carried the weight of humiliation when those officers dismissed her competence, letting their assumptions settle like stones in her chest. But that weight was gone now, dissolved somewhere over the Atlantic between crisis and resolution. Because when metal screamed and electronics failed and lives hung by threads, there had been no question about who belonged in that cockpit. She had earned her place there the same way she had earned everything else, through knowledge, competence, and the simple willingness to do the job without asking for credit. The terminal swallowed her into warmth and light, away from the storm. But the truth remained on the tarmac for everyone to see. Sometimes the person they tried to dismiss is exactly the person everyone needs most. What would you have thought if you had seen Kara dismissed at the beginning of that flight? Would you have trusted her when the SEAL Aviator called her name? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one and your perspective matters. If this story reminded you that expertise doesn't always announce itself, hit that like button. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, and share this with someone who knows the quietest voice in the room might be the one that saves everyone. More stories about hidden heroes are waiting right here on your screen. Click one and keep going because I'll be back tomorrow with another reminder that courage comes in forms you don't expect. Until then, remember, the person they put in the back might be the only one who can bring everyone home.